Hello, welcome to the latest episode of No Franchise Fatigue, the podcast where we dissect cinematic franchises piece by piece because we celebrate the insanity of sequels, prequels, reboots, remakes, remakequels, spin-offs. We're all about it. So, I'm your host today, Matt, and I'm joined by my always cursed and possibly telekinetic co-host straight from the abandoned local mental institution, Sean.
Wasn't abandoned when I got here.
All right, so today we are going to be doing a cannonball straight into the deep, dark, and craggy well of Sadako's world by looking at the first four entries of the original Japanese Ghost franchise, Ring. As always, we will be talking fairly extensively through spoilers of all four films. So if you need to take a minute to watch the films or rewatch the films, please do so now. Otherwise, pull the hair out of in front of your eyes and let's get crawling through this franchise as we get started.
One brief note, I refuse to call any of these movies Ringu,
Oh,
but I
oh,
acknowledge that it's technically its Western title.
it's American title, not even Western, because in the UK, it's the franchise is called Ring,
No
which
kidding.
is yeah. Literally, I've got the I imported the box set from Arrow Video for the first four films on Blu-ray, which came out last year, and it is literally called the Ring Collection because all the movies are called Ring, Ring 2, Ring 0, Spiral. It's the actual translated title of it.
So it doesn't even have
Um,
Kazan. Interesting.
yep. And what's funny is Arrow finally got the rights to release all these films here in the US, and they're doing so in October, releasing this same box set, this Blu-ray box set, which is fantastic, by the way, in the US. And what's funny is I got a press release about it the other day, and the new cover art, it's the same cover artwork, except it says Ringu on
Hmm.
it. I hope they don't keep it Ringu, but I'm sure the company that originally released Ring here in the US probably was like, you have to call it Ringu.
Which,
So
full disclosure, is technically a company that I work for, DreamWorks.
yeah, yeah. Well, and I suppose this is a kind of a good place to start because, between the titles, and I'm sure we will jump between either Ringu or Ring. The second film in the franchise was Rosin, which translates to Spiral. So I'll be referring to it as Spiral for the sake of simplicity. But why don't you throw me down a little context, Sean. How
Hmm.
did you come into the Ring franchise?
My first exposure was the Gore Verbinski remake in, I believe, 2001, which was, at the time I saw it, bar none, the scariest goddamn thing I ever saw. Like, there wasn't, being entirely frank, there wasn't even a close second for me. And as times passed on, my opinion of the movie matured, and I have strong opinions about the sequels. But in and of itself, I still stand behind the movie. Gore Verbinski's remake is actually a great film. Like, actually great. And one of the few PG-13 horror movies that's worth a damn.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I'm sure eventually we'll get to an episode where we talk about the American side of this franchise outside of this franchise as a whole is kind of wild.
What's interesting, I think, in specific context of this, is my second exposure to The Ring and the Japanese version of the story was not the movies. As a matter of fact, within the last couple of days is the first time I have seen many of these films. You're getting hot takes from me on a lot of this. My second exposure was I bumped into the first book they translated and brought over. And I ended up really hooked on that and ended up reading the trilogy at the time. I have, again, subsequently in the last couple of days, realized that ballooned to six books. So I can't say I'm current on them anymore, but I've at least read the original trilogy, which would be Ring, Loop, or Ring, Spiral, and Loop.
Right. Right. And all of these the we should say they're based on the books, but it's pretty loose base. And obviously, I have not read the books, so you're going to be kind of the person that's going to have to guide me through how these kind of interact with the books to some degree. But that's really interesting that you jumped into the books because, like I said, I've never read the books. My first experience with the franchise was also Gore Verbinski's The Ring, and partially that's because it was the only way to see this franchise to start off with. The Ringu, as it was released here, Ring wasn't actually released until I think it was the year after or 2 years after the Ring came out. So it didn't even get a U.S. release until the Ring had actually shown up in theaters, became this huge cultural phenomenon, and then it was like, distribution companies were like, "Oh shit, maybe we should release these because maybe they're going to be popular." So
It's definitely worth saying the internet culture was not the same at the time. It was a lot more stratified, so knowledge about this movie was specialized. And import culture wasn't the same. Importing in those days was expensive. This was not a digital file. You're typically buying a physical thing, and you were lucky if it had subtitles in its own language, much less your language.
right, right. And so that's what makes this franchise kind of interesting is that, yeah, you're talking about the remake kind of came to the US first, and then it was the Japanese films that got, released here in the US through distribution on home video. And so that's what kind of makes this franchise interesting because I again started with Gore Verbinski's. I went on to this first film once it came out. I was all about it. I wanted to see it. And then we'll get more into like kind of how we feel about the each of these films. But I eventually just kind of worked my way through the entire franchise. I actually, if outside of the remake, pretty much watched these in order. I was able to kind of watch them in the order that they were meant to be seen in, including the first sequel, Spiral, which we'll talk a little bit more about, and kind of the weird aspects of that film as a forgotten sequel. So yeah, so that's kind of where we're coming from here today. Coming into this franchise, we're going to be taking a look at the thematic elements between these first four films, kind of what they look like. We'll be talking a little bit about kind of the book series and kind of analyzing that. But I think you have to start where it all starts, and that's looking at Hideo Nakata's Ring from 1998, which is in my opinion, still one of my I'd be tempted to say top 10 horror films of all time.
Wow.
I'm just throwing it out there. No, what's funny is I feel like I'm kind of the black sheep in terms of a more of the mainstream of the majority of people. Majority of people don't necessarily like this film. A lot of the kind of the special features and behind the scenes I've seen this movie because it had kind of that indie art house kind of release in the West. I mean, it was obviously a huge box office success in Japan, but because it was kind of this indie rollout where it was just hitting film festivals, word of mouth carried it more than anything else. And even to this day, when movies do that, the hype train gets pushed really far up and it leads so many people to disappointment. When I saw it for the first time, it was such a different, even though it's basically the same film as Gore Verbinski's remake, it's such a completely different feeling film.
Yeah.
Uh, for me, I'm all about it. I'm all about it. And when I was rewatching this for this podcast, I even like tweeted out on my Twitter. I was like, man, all of you people who are so-called like A24 fans or elevated horror fans, you all need to go revisit this movie because if this movie got released even in this format today, this movie would be like a box office success in the US, I think.
I do agree with that.
So that's a kind of my hot take on kind of how we're going to talk a lot about cycles and how things go in circles in this franchise, and I think that's what's kind of fun about the Ring franchise is that the newest film, which is called Sadako, just came out last year, or was it earlier this year? Might have been earlier this year. Hideo Nakata came back to the franchise as a director for this latest film, so again, it's kind of come full circle, and I think that's really interesting. So.
Think we should just start like we always do with a synopsis and analysis of each film. Like you say, starting with Ring, there are these two young women who are talking about this myth of a killer tape, where when you watch it and you die 7 days later, which is basically the part of the franchise that kind of everybody knows. That's the part that sticks out, which is kind of funny because, especially in the Japanese series, that particular part of it becomes less true very rapidly.
Right, right. And I again, as a person who adores this movie Ring, I love that it's got this like Three Stooges style, and not like in tone or comedy, but it gets you looking one way and then it slaps you from the other direction because it's got you looking one way. So the way they've got you looking is at this cursed videotape and all of this mythos behind this cursed videotape, when the videotape itself is not the threat. It's actually the symptom of the actual threat. And I think that's great.
which interestingly enough is one of the few things that carries between the book and the movie as well, because not only is the American remake very different than any of the Japanese versions, but this movie is actually very different from the book, and we'll get into those differences a little more as it's appropriate. Just overall, like, it's conceptually very different because Ring, the book, is a medical mystery. It still has the supernatural angle of psychics and curses and such, but they absolutely focus in on it from the medical angle. Whereas this, basically, immediately after this conversation, and they talked about, they watched the tape, one of these girls die from the curse. And that brings in
Asakawa.
Asakawa, yes.
Yep.
So one of them has a reporter aunt named Reiko Asakawa who investigates the case, which basically tracks her niece and their friends back to this cabin they rented in a small town called Izu, where she sees just kind of a nondescript tape that she points out behind the innkeeper and is like, I want to look at that one. It's kind of implied to be a little bit of intuition, as psychics and psychic powers and phenomena play very, very heavily into this series, and it's treated very non-ironically. It's not a comedy aspect. It's literally, that's what this is about. It is a psychic horror series.
And I think you bring up a good point, because the ESP aspect of this franchise, I think it's more pronounced as you go.
Absolutely.
And we'll be talking more about it in the sequels. But in this movie, you're right, it's played almost in this realistic term, because it's indicated that she doesn't have it necessarily, but her ex-husband does. But the
And
way
son,
that it's
a touch.
treated is, it's like he has, like you said, intuition.
Yeah.
It's never treated as like this like superpower or anything like that. That he has kind of this intuition, and
And
that
it's a slight cultural difference as well, because that's not considered ridiculous in Japan.
right. It's something that's more commonplace and a lot of a cultural aspect to it. And I think this movie deals with it really, really smartly. And it's interesting when you talk about the book and it comes from a medical standpoint, coming into this almost like a Michael Crichton, like Michael Crichton did with like Andromeda Strain, where it's like this killer virus that comes to the earth. It's an alien bug,
Yeah.
but it's all about science. It's the scientific viewpoint of it. And this movie doesn't do that at all.
No.
There's not, I mean, it plays
I-
everything very realistically and grounded. Well, right, because she shows up at the cabin that they're done. She's heard about the videotape at this point. She has interviewed these young girls in the beginning who are talking about, which is the classic urban legend, which I really like about this movie. Is this movie presents itself as an urban legend first and foremost. The girls in the beginning are talking about, the cursed videotape, and that's why all these four kids in different parts of the city all died at the same time. It's this cursed videotape, and you have to, you're going to get a phone call and you're going to die in 7 days after you watch it. And it's always like, it's a friend of a friend, which is always the classic way to know when it's an urban legend, is like, oh, this happened to a friend of a friend. It's like to give it like, weight and longevity. There's this thing, so she kind of goes to investigate, kind of putting two and two together. So she ends up at this cabin and finds the tape, the accursed blank tape.
So she watches it, and to pretty much, I've only seen two of the four versions of this film, but both versions do this tape differently, but to equal effect. It's one thing I will say is pretty much equally scary in both versions. Gore Verbinski's is definitely a lot more visceral in a gothic horror kind of sense, and it's got kind of sound effects going like Eraserhead, and it's just really, really upsetting at a visceral, you feel it level. Whereas I'd say the Japanese version, this tape is psychologically upsetting because it almost feels like you're watching like religious rites from a forgotten lost culture or something. Like you're watching something taboo that you shouldn't be seeing. And it's really weird and kind of off-putting, and I love that aspect of this movie.
And I even think that going into that, and what's great is in the Blu-ray set that I have from Arrow, you can watch the video in
Oh.
its entirety, like on your big screen. So I think for my Halloween party this year, I'm just going to put that on a loop in the background and see how many people notice it. So, but I think you're absolutely right. There's the one thing about Ring as a film is that there's not a whole lot of things that are in your face. This movie is all about subtlety, and it's all about this lingering feeling, this almost like an existential dread of what's going to happen. And I think the videotape really personifies that. Like you said, it's like you're in a place that you're not supposed to be, watching something you're not supposed to. It's not actively trying to gross you out, not like Gore Verbinski's does at times. His is kind of
Well,
actively.
there's actual like gore to it, not heavy gore, but like there's injuries and stuff in it, and it's flies and maggots and lots of stuff like that. And this movie doesn't do that at all. You got a guy with like a scarf over his head just pointing.
Yeah, and the woman combing her hair in the mirror, which you find out later is Sadako's mother. But she's like combing her hair, and then you just see the mirror kind of flash real quickly to the next side of the wall, and later on it's revealed that the way where the mirror is set at is you shouldn't be able to see it from a camera's viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Like one of the characters makes a point that they were like, oh, in real life, if you were recording this, the camera would be shown in the mirror.
Which something I've always found fascinating is the specific kind of psychic that Sadako and her mother were, which is that they can project mental images on blank photograph paper. And this is, depending on your feelings about psychics generally, considered a real phenomenon, or at least this is something that's written about. As well as actually the cursed videotape is an old urban legend as well. This is a couple of ideas kind of meshed together. The original author, Koji Suzuki, really wanted to kind of create a horror where he invented a new type of Yurei, which we'll get into that in a moment too, but that's basically a Japanese ghost. But as well, he wanted to give a medical or at least a logical justification for something like an urban legend of a videotape that could kill you. It was his specific intent to kind of throw logistics into it. And I just like how I think that ties a neat bow on it, the psychic photography thing.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that brings up a good point. At this point, where now we're adding in this technology aspect to it, and this is kind of a theme that runs through all of these movies and runs through J-horror in general. But the technology aspect is really bringing these old stories, these old Japanese tales, from the Kwaidan writings and things like that, into a modern setting. It's kind of like when Freddy Krueger came into the suburbs. There was this idea of like this isolated horror having this videotape built in a cabin that's a rare over a well, things like that. And suddenly it's like all these kids in the city are being affected by it.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a great way for the Japanese culture to kind of like bridge that gap between like, here's our traditional ghost stories and here's what a modern horror movie kind of looks like. And, when you look at kind of the history of like Japanese horror throughout the 80s and into the 90s, Japanese horror completely abandoned a lot of the ghost stories and things and really focused on really visceral stuff like the guinea pig series, tons of that kind of like really in your face stuff. So, which is why like Ring was such kind of a surprise, was that it was a complete 180 from where horror was at the time in Japanese cinema. And it was kind of like, no, we have great stuff from our past. We just need to modernize it. And I think that that's a really cool way to do it.
As we said, Reiko does watch the tape and instantly just feels in her gut that her life is in real danger and that this is real. Another thing I kind of like about this is she does not question it for a second at any moment. She looks at the clock and goes, well, I got about 7 days to fix this. And so she meets up with her ex-husband, Ryuji, to help investigate. And basically, he asks her to make a copy of the tape for him to look at closely. And he watches it as well. And what they end up basically, he's a college professor and they together just start this really intense investigation that we end up learning about Shizuko Yamamura, who was this incredibly powerful psychic who was put through these very public trials by a professor that she, by all accounts, passed. She was able to predict everything the guy had written in a sealed envelope, but it just went horribly wrong. She was accused of being a fraud, and like it's never made super clear specifically what happened, but people died in this incident, and several, and it's basically even more specifically implied that her daughter Sadako had something to do with it. They weren't sure she was a psychic herself, but this was a pretty solid indication that she might be.
Yeah, I think this is because we're starting to learn a lot about the background here. This is where the movie starts to shift from cursed videotape to asking not like what is killing these people to why is it killing people. And I think, as you mentioned in the book, it's a little bit different, but here there's kind of an interesting switch over as it moves into this and adds in the ex-husband, which the relationship between her and him is really fascinating because I think they have a remarkably interesting on-screen chemistry because like when they're first introduced you're not even sure how they're, I don't want to say related, but how they're connected.
Yeah.
So you don't know how they're connected. And as it starts to reveal, because this movie does everything, like I said, very subtly. So all of the information that it's revealed to is very subtle. And, as you start to learn and put the pieces together for yourself about who he is, his role to the child, to her son, you get to see a lot of these really interesting kind of ways that your audience is required to put it together instead of the movie telling you, which I think is a huge departure from Gore Verbinski's. Because Gore Verbinski's will tell you. The fact that Sadako, like you mentioned, she watches the tape and then she leaves because she gets this kind of like weird feeling of dread. She gets a phone call and there's nothing on the other end of the line.
That's right. There's
Whereas
no
in
spur of 7 days or anything like that. Yeah.
no, yeah, Gore Verbinski's is like, you're gonna die in 7 days, right? And you're like, okay, thanks for telling me that. I already know that, And this movie definitely like you have to pick out the small pieces. You have to remember the 7 day marker from before when she's interviewing the girl in the beginning, where the girl's like, oh yeah, you die in a week, you die in 7 days, right? Seven ends up being kind of an interesting number in this movie. You'll notice the time on the clock when she looks at the clock, because she's the time when she gets the phone call, she looks at the clock, it's actually 7:07,
It's
which I think is a really kind of a
very
cool.
Japanese as well, actually.
Right. I love that. I love that there's kind of this sense of dread that the movie isn't going to be straight out telling you everything. You kind of have to put it together, which is again why a lot of people don't love this movie. They think it's too slow, it's too subtle, it's really intentional in what it does, but it's gonna make you work.
So before we kind of roll into the ending, 2 points real quick of mine, which is one, I just plainly don't like Japanese ghost stories, and that's my number one personal problem with this movie. It's nothing inherent to the movie. It's a completely personal block. Yeah, I don't love this movie. I respect it greatly, and it is a well-made movie. It's a brilliant piece of cinema. It's just not compelling to me. And one of the reasons the book kind of was, weirdly, is it does delve a little more into the specifics of how the tape kills, which this is a very, very much Cliff Notes version. But what happened to Sadako in the book is that her father had tuberculosis and she was visiting him in a sanitarium. She ends up being sexually assaulted by her father's doctor. The doctor had smallpox. She contracted smallpox. This is going to come back in a moment. And he ends up killing her because he discovers that she's hermaphrodite. He kills her, dumps her in the well. The thing about how the tape kills in the book is that one of the things you have to understand about Japanese culture is that anything and everything can have a will and a spirit. And so what happened was Sadako's psychic powers and rage merged with the murderous will and intent of smallpox, and imprinted itself on a blank tape accidentally left at a cabin just incidentally built above this well. And the way it kills you is the specific series of images, which is completely different in the book as well. It's actually just random, basically, images in the book. They do relate to the story, but basically reprograms your brain into giving itself a clump of smallpox that hits your heart and gives you a heart attack.
Which we will talk further in, because that's a point in one of the sequels where they start to dig into this a little bit more, where they talk about the smallpox and the tumor on the heart and things like that. So that actually becomes weirdly more relevant in the sequel, even though this movie completely just like shovels it aside and is like, man, I don't know if an audience will buy this.
And Michael Crichton is actually a great comparison because the Andromeda Strain has almost the exact same difference between the book and the movies, the multiple movies they've tried to do with that. One credit I will give this is Yurei is a very, very traditional kind of Japanese ghost created by basically dying in some sort of emotional state, typically rage, if we're talking about horror. And Yurei is actually really, really specific. They have usually a white burial gown, long black hair, and limbs that don't work quite right because they're dead. They usually kind of hang low and everything. And more so than the American remake, which does more in line with a Exorcist-like contortionism. This movie, especially the original, the few times you do actively see Sadako, she is 100% a modernization of a traditional Yurei, and that is really kind of cool. She's like a techno Yurei.
When we get to it, because you really don't see her in the videotape until the very end of the movie. So in fact, in my notes, the first time you ever see Sadako is 28 minutes into the film, and she's in a reflection of the TV standing in the background when Reiko first watches the video and turns it off. When she gets that weird feeling, in the reflection, you'll see it because the camera's pointed at a thing. You'll see Sadako in the background standing there. That is the first time you see her. It's super subtle. They never really pull attention to her outside of the fact that you get kind of this like weird feeling. And because the protagonist's face is like so big in the screen, that's what you're looking at. You're not looking at behind her shoulder. And I think that's, again, kind of goes into the subtlety of when J-horror gets really good, is this idea of getting you to look one way, hitting you from the other, and it's usually with something small and creepy. It's not something loud and brash. So I think that's really cool about it. And I totally agree, even about like how you said the Gore Verbinski version of her. Number one, she does move like a contortionist in inhumane ways. And then you also get to see her full face. Like at the end, I don't love that nearly as much. I love the fact that in this one, you don't see her face outside of one sliver. And again, what I like about this movie is that it goes for this old traditional, modernizing it, and it goes for subtle. I'm all about the subtle. Give me subtle and creepy and something that's unnerving more than something that's going to be in my face and terrifying.
So one of the things I do give this movie credit for, and it is across all versions, including the book, is I actually have always liked the idea that they go to the cabin and try and exorcise and release Sadako's spirit. And to pretty much the only body effect in the movie, which I'm a huge fan of Japanese horror, but as you mentioned, I like that other kind. I'm big on the Tetsuo, the Iron Mans, and stuff like that. So it does lead to pretty much the only real effect in the movie, which is this face that melts away from a skull. And I don't even know particularly how they did it, but it's a great looking effect. You can tell it's practical though, which I really like.
And almost everything in this movie is decently practical, despite the fact that it's
Only
visual heavy.
Sorry, yeah. The only real close up you ever see of Sadako is of her fingers. And trying to climb out of the well, she basically ripped her own fingernails off trying to climb out. And it's this ghost with no fingernails. That is an impressively terrifying effect for me.
Well, and now riddle me this, Batman, but I don't think they ever explain why she's missing her fingernails in this movie. I don't think that's explained until later. I don't think that's explained
That's the
until
detail I know and kind of fill in on my own.
well, right, and I think that this movie kind of does that when you see her hands and you see her fingernails are gone, and there's just kind of like these like bloodied like what happens when you lose your fingernail, right? I think you're supposed to get the idea, oh, her fingernails are gone, and then think to yourself, why are they gone? Again, it doesn't spell it out for you. I don't think they actually say, and I might be wrong on this, but I don't think they actually say until Ring 2 that all of her fingernails are gone. She probably was trying to claw her way out of the well. And I think that's a really clever way, again, of going about it. Here's all this detail about this girl and what she went through. And we're not going to really tell you. We're going to let your imagination go with it further. And I think, again, that kind of builds into the atmosphere of the film.
Yeah. So the thing I really like about this specifically, though, is, and again, across all versions, they do find Sadako's body and, report it to authorities, get her a proper burial, all that good stuff, and it does not work.
I love this. I love that it doesn't work because it's like the greatest. It's like this old haunted house trope, the changeling, all the way back and especially in American cinema, there's this idea of like the spirit needs something, and if we help them get it, they will go away. And it doesn't work here. They're like, we're going to give you the justice that you needed, and she's not about the justice.
It's one of the reasons. See, Japanese ghost stories don't scare me and they don't compel me, but one of the reasons it always has a higher than average chance than an American ghost story, which I also don't find especially compelling, is that exactly like you're saying, American ghost stories basically, or Western, I should even say more broadly, Western ghost stories, it's always a spirit of vengeance because it's been wronged in some way or it was hateful. Either way, a good Christian exorcism or, solving the spirit's murder or what have you, more or less releases the ghost, and that's fine. Japanese fiction and Japanese stories do not work that way. If you break whatever the taboo is for this ghost, whether it be watching the videotape in Ring or walking into the goddamn house in Ju-on, that ghost is going to kill you. No two ways about it. And it's not, I mean, to a Western audience's sense of how this is supposed to go, it seems like borderline unfair.
Yeah, and this movie again plays a lot on that there's a lot of this times where it feels like the movie should have shocked you, and especially from, like you said, a Western audience, you kind of expect it to kind of come out and grab you with an exorcism or whatever. And in fact, and you just talked about it, the moment where they're in the well and they discover the body and the bones, right? And they pull her out of the water and her face kind of dissolves or whatever. That moment is really, really interesting because it is all about atmosphere. It's not about this like scary moment, because normally I feel like in a Western ghost film, if the lady, like, because the way that it pulls up is that you've got this heavy atmosphere, she's down in the water, you see Sadako's hair come to the surface of the water first, and then you see the head, and then the hand reaches out and grabs her, right? That would have been played for a shock scare. And this movie doesn't do that. And then secondly,
Sad.
yeah, it's sad. And then secondly, when she like grabs the skeleton and pulls the skeleton and the face melts, great thing, again, not a scare moment. And in fact, the main protagonist, Reiko, literally doesn't even look shocked at the whole moment. Like this thing like fucking melts in front of her and melts in front of her. She doesn't even look shocked. She pulls the skeleton closest to her and like embraces it in like this motherly embrace,
Which
right?
does interestingly tie into one of the themes, which is otherwise, by all accounts, Reiko, not a great mother.
Right. And I'm sure this is a big part that's different in the book, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but a single mother in Japan, even at the time in like 1998, was not something you commonly saw, and you were seen as kind of like as trash, for that reason, and which is, a sad statement, because there's this idea that she, later on you even find out in the sequels, they're like, well, we didn't even give her really big articles because she was a mom. Like, we wouldn't even let her get promoted because she was a mom. We always gave her like the shitty stuff to write about as a journalist. And you're like, that's so weird. But she's a single mom trying to do it on her own, and she even mentions like, well, my son knows how to cook dinner because like sometimes I'm late. And what's funny is in nowadays 2019, single mothers raising children on their own, having to work full time, one or two jobs, is seen as almost heroic. And you get this idea in this movie, they kind of play it as like she's trying her best, but she's kind of failing.
So,
And I think that's interesting.
boy, do you want to talk about a difference in the book?
Yeah, because it's a man, right?
Yes, in the book it is Kazuyuki Asakawa, and basically Ryuji is just a friend of his, and his wife and daughter are basically incidental to the plot of the book. They do end up seeing the tape, and he is up against the time limit of their 7 days, but regardless, they're otherwise pretty much prop to the book. One of the best changes any of the media has made, I think, is this specific change. As you say, I think casting the protagonist as a single mother and woman inherently adds a subtext to this movie that I think is only to the film's benefit.
I agree. And it's funny because I've read varying things about how the author has reacted to the change of gender to it, because even the kid is a different gender, right? He has a little girl,
Yes.
not a little boy.
And so Reiko does survive her 7 days and ends up putting together basically that it's because she copied the tape and showed it to somebody else. Now, this is the one specific point that causes the book to just inherently make more sense than any of the movies ever can. When you consider that part of the curse is the rage of smallpox as well in the book, the idea of copying itself and infecting someone else being how to break the curse actually has a poetic logic to it.
Yeah, and I think it should be mentioned at this point, like you said, she discovers that by making a copy of the tape, that's how she broke the curse. Now, she gave it to somebody else. She passed it along. In this case, it was her ex-husband, Ryuji. And he passes away. He's in the final moments, he's the one that's killed by Sadako in the classic coming through the TV screen, which was filmed backwards.
Big piece of the movie.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Which comes in the final 10 minutes, which is her like kind of crickety walk was actually filmed in reverse, which is why it looks inhuman.
They cribbed David Lynch's old trick.
Yeah. Yep. So yeah, they filmed her and that was in reverse. It was played in reverse. That's why it makes her look like she's not moving naturally. So she kills him, and that's the only time you get to see part of her face, is you get to see her eye, which I had read trivia that was actually a man's eye. I've read that. I don't know how true that is, but you only see her eye, and I think that's really cool. That's kind of the classic scene from this movie. In the original UK release of Ring, the cover was actually Sadako's eye.
Yeah.
That was the cover. And
being the original release in the American DVD as well.
So yeah, so that you get that. But what I think is really interesting about Ryuji's death and her finding out about the copy is, again, this movie never tells you that. It never tells you that making the copy, you see her figure it out, and she figures it out because she sees an apparition of Ryuji with the drape over his head from the video.
Pointing at the
copy of the tape. And she puts it all together, and it brings up this interesting idea of like, why did she see him? Because you get the idea that she's probably doesn't have ESP, that he does. Was he strong enough from the other side to be able to project himself, to be able to tell her to save his son?
Sequels that seem to think so.
Yeah, I'm like, I love it. I love that it's him, but you don't see his face because he has the scarf or shroud on.
I'm going to be entirely honest. I never put together that's supposed to be Ryuji.
Yeah, it's just he's wearing the same jacket as he is on the floor when he dies. It's like the same clothes that he's wearing. And he's pointing out the copy. Oh, I love it. I love it that he comes back to help her out. You get this idea earlier that when he meets his son in the rain, when he has the umbrella and they meet outside, that there's almost this like they don't even recognize each other. That's how disconnected he is from his family. And yet, in the end, he's able to tell her how to save the son who has watched the video at this point, as kind of like one last selfless act to be like, I need you to save my son.
Another major difference being with the book being Ryuji in the book, not a very sympathetic character at all. Actually, he's kind of a dick and is obviously just the dude's best friend, but actually has ulterior motives, which become kind of clearer in the sequel, which seems like a pretty good shuffling point because we're going to go with, I think, first Spiral.
Yes, Spiral, the forgotten sequel. This is where literally in the paths of writing out this linear franchise that they split. Because Spiral takes one path and Ring 2 takes the other path. It should be mentioned at this time that what makes Spiral the most interesting in context is that it was filmed at the same time as Ring because the book was already out and the book was already a success. Different director. It does share a lot of the same cast. And it was actually released in a double feature with Ring in theaters.
And for what it's worth, not as many book specific notes because this one actually, of the movies I've seen, is the most accurate to its source material.
Which is both awesome and problematic. Because the from Ring diverges from the book enough that it kind of created its own thing. Super popular. Spiral comes out in theaters. It feels different. It has a lot of different logic to it. It's obvious that, when you make two films at the same time, you don't get to see what audiences liked and disliked about a movie before you make the sequel.
This one actually falls a lot more in line with its medical horror origins. This is very much a medical horror movie.
Yeah, and like you said before, when you talk about the smallpox and the lump on the heart, that's all explained here in Spiral. Spiral was a huge flop in theaters. Nobody liked it. It was panned by audiences. It didn't do very well. Ring did phenomenal, became this huge film event. At the time, become the highest grossing horror film in Japan, and all kinds of fun stuff like that. Spiral is this huge flop. It makes Spiral a very interesting watch. Just to let you know how much Spiral is as a forgotten kind of film, is that in this Arrow box set, they have individual cases for Ring, Ring 2, and Ring 0. Spiral is a special feature on Ring 2.
What?
Yeah. 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 So, like, even when you read back, like on the back of it, it talks about it's like, oh, the Ring trilogy. It literally is like, oh, Ring, the film that started it all, plus the chilling sequel, Ring 2, and the haunting origin story, Ring 0, as well as the original sequel, Spiral. It's like off to the side. It truly is like this forgotten film in the series. And part of it is, for better or worse, I get it, because it is so different than the other, especially Ring and Ring 2. Tonally, it's different. It rings a lot differently. So I have not read the book. So how did you overall enjoy Spiral?
I really, really like this one.
Well, you said before, you really dig the medical
I like
style of the books.
I like the medical angle of it. I mean, I'm a reasonably upbeat guy in real life, but I do like my media really nihilistic, and boy, this is a dark one.
It's incredibly dark. Even the way it starts off with its main character, like trying to commit suicide.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where you start, is like this character that's reached rock bottom. And
But
just
episodes
because,
in a row where we're doing Asian movie series where one of them starts with a suicide attempt.
yeah, yeah, we get dark here. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. That's really cool. I also really enjoyed this movie. I don't think it's nearly as good as Ring. I think it's got significant flaws to it, and we'll go into those in a second. But I actually kind of like that it's different.
Mhm.
I like that it feels different. I like that it takes what Ring had to offer and goes kind of into a full left turn with it without necessarily negating what Ring had to say. And I think that's clever.
What I think is kind of interesting about this genre as a whole is that the when people talk about Japanese horror, they do always either talk about their ghost stories or body horror. And it gets kind of lost in the shuffle, but Japan does actually have a very, very strong medical horror pedigree in its own right as well. Some of it combines with body horror. The Guinea Pig series started out being about medical experiments. But on top of that, you've got the only real breakout I could think of offhand is Parasite Eve, but is very deeply a medical horror movie.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've never thought about that. That the medical horror is actually its own kind of subgenre, especially in J horror.
But starting off here, Spiral starts out with Ryuji from the last movie has a friend slash rival named Takayama, who is tapped to do the autopsy on Ryuji's body. And as you've sort of hinted at, discovers a tumor in the autopsy that has a note in it, weirdly, in code nonetheless. So
now I want to point this out because like you bring this up and I wrote this in my notes as at this point, like the Ring films, as I'm watching them, I'm writing notes. I get more cynical as each one goes. I get more cynical. But in this one, I wrote it and I was like, where the fuck does this note come from? Like all in caps is in my notes, right? And then usually when something like that happens in the movie, and when it comes back to it, I'll put a note beside it saying this is where it comes from, whatever. I don't have another note. I don't know where that note actually came from. I don't know if he just like willed it into existence. I thought maybe he like swallowed something. It was in his stomach. They never explain it.
In the book, it's actually implied to be kind of a combination of the two. He did swallow a piece of newspaper, but he willed the numbers onto it.
Wait. So you're telling me I was right for both
Yeah.
of my choices when I give you an or choice?
Yes.
Okay, that sounds good.
And basically, right. He knew, or like I said, Ryuji in the book is not quite as nice a guy. And in this movie, it's sort of touched on as well. But there is a fair amount of this movie that is actually a plan, like literally a plan. And there's this long kind of complex, almost, you wouldn't call it a heist movie, but some horror movie equivalent thereof, of the way the pieces come together in this film for you to kind of realize what is actually happening, which is actually part of one of the aspects I really like about it. But regardless, Ryuji basically has an inkling that Takayama is going to be the one to do his autopsy. And he knew that Ryuji liked codes and puzzles when they were kids, and he figured the guy would be curious enough to look into it, basically. One of the first things we kind of learn is that Ryuji's ex and protagonist of the first film, Reiko Asakawa, did not pull through.
Right. And this is a part that kind of sticks in my craw a little bit. The ending of Ring is left very open. They don't necessarily, you get this idea, she understands how to break the curse using the copy tape. We are not specifically told that though. So we don't know if it'll work. We don't know why necessarily. And the end of the film is her driving off and calling her father. Basically, you get the idea that she's going to ask her father to watch a copy of the tape for her son to live on. And the way that they literally like just literally like take her out of this story by putting her into a car wreck is one of those like classic, oh, we couldn't get her back. She only signed a 1-picture deal and we need to get rid of the character right away. That's what it feels like to me. And it's kind of a shame because you get the idea that like they talk about there's a tape deck in the back of the car and they're like, why is there a tape deck? This is crazy. And so you get the idea that maybe she didn't get to save her son, which is weird to think about because you're like, wow, you just killed off everyone from the first film except for the girlfriend character Mai.
One thing I will backstep and mention is during the autopsy, Takayama does have a vision of Ryuji coming to life and sitting up in the middle of the autopsy, which I will say is really rad. Like the effect is really good looking. I'm very, very fond of that sequence, actually.
I actually have that written in my notes. I said, it opens with the announcement of Ryuji's death to an old friend of the autopsy. The autopsy is very meticulous and procedural, like you said about the book, indicating the different tone and more scientific tone, the discovery of the thing with the paper in it and the number. And then it was like, there's also a more visceral feel to this movie than the previous one. And I wrote Ryuji's corpse sitting up stark naked.
Like the normal version of the scene you'd see in a Western movie, either where it's still got the gore and viscera. Like he's already completely cleaned out. It's like this hollow corpse sitting up. It's just half a set of ribs and spine.
It's amazing. And I think the special effects in this movie are pretty fantastic. And it's great that they're like, here, we're going to give you something a little bit more visual instead of atmospheric this time around. And I think that it's a good statement for this movie to start with the character who's threatening to commit suicide. It's super dark, super melodramatic versus the first one, which is more subtle. It's not super melodramatic. This one is. And this one's got a little bit more viscera. It's all about that kind of scientific human body aspect to it.
So, Takayama, who is grieving and suicidal over his own recently lost son, does basically come across this videotape and watches it, figuring he's got nothing to lose. This is a very nihilistic movie.
It's so nihilistic. I love it.
And supernatural happenings do start happening. So basically, Takayama and Mai, who is Ryuji's girlfriend / assistant.
There's no conflict there.
Yeah, right. Basically are trying to figure out why Asakawa died, since she broke the curse. In the process of kind of working through this, Takayama also destroys the tapes, trying to be its last ever victim. If he can't break the curse, at least it won't hurt anybody else.
Which is interesting, because immediately they're like, here's your answer to this whole thing. Like, destroy the tapes and just sacrifice yourself. And you get this idea that the guy really has nothing to lose, and solves the movie like 20 minutes in.
Pretty much.
Which is great. Yeah, because again, here we go. We got you looking one way and we're going to slap you from the other.
He also finds this diary, and the movie it's a slower, kind of more contemplative movie. And it's funny because when you look at it in bullet points, it feels like the one that reads the fastest, because the bullet points are kind of the devil's in the details of this movie. But Takayama and Mai both survive the 7 days, and he starts kind of figuring maybe this whole thing was a myth the whole time. And he's feeling pretty good about himself for about a second, when then he finds out Mai died after all. And not only did she died giving birth. So what they end up finding out is Sadako is actually powerful enough to spread her curse through more than one medium. And she actually cursed Takayama and Mai through the diary. On top of that, you discover that the 7 days thing was always arbitrary, and actually Sadako really has the power to hit people at will. So the birth is actually Sadako resurrected herself. She manipulated the virus through a kind of convoluted thing that's explained a little better in the book, but basically there's two variations of the ring virus. One is in a circle and one is more of a straight line, and they vaguely look like egg and sperm cells. And she was actually able to impregnate Mai with the sperm cell version of the ring virus. And she uses it to take control of Mai for the last day of her life, and then births herself fully grown and kills Mai for her trouble. And basically, in what I think is kind of brilliant and sort of the dark twist of the movie, the resurrected Sadako basically goes to Takayama and says, look, I can use this same process to resurrect your son. He'll have all his memories. He'll be exactly the same age as when you lost him. It'll be like he was never gone. And all you have to do is be complacent. Let this happen. Which I find kind of brilliant, because of course he accepts. What else is he going to do? Die? And then acknowledges that he's probably more or less ushering in the apocalypse.
Yeah, this is This is a strange movie because, like you said, it goes into the more scientific thing. The idea that we have an STS, or as I like to call it, a sexually transmitted Sadako, is strange. You get this idea that the virus is mutating. There's a subplot here that's going on with Reiko's boss from the newspaper, because every one of these fucking movies has to have a journalist, I guess.
Weird.
That's like a weird trope that they use. And so he comes on board. He acts as kind of this weird surrogate for the audience, where he explains all the plot to everybody. Like every scene he's in, he explains the plot. He's just like a walking exposition. He's the one that goes over, because you find out the grandfather was killed. So you get the idea that maybe the son was supposed to survive. They showed the grandfather the tape. He has died. That's where they kind of find the first smallpox in the heart as they're going through there. And so we have this whole like tangent, even as we're going on with this journalist who's kind of explaining everything. And you get this idea that the virus has mutated because he's affected differently by the virus. And that's when you kind of first learn that it's translated from the journals, because he read the journal, Reiko's journal. That's what he read, and it affected him differently. And he's got the new virus, the new ring virus, which is a really interesting idea, in terms of like, again, this franchise is like, we're only one sequel in and we're going to evolve this significantly. We're going to literally evolve it. Just like the ring virus is evolving to affect people differently, this is going to be that way too. And I don't know, some of it works for me, some of it doesn't. I think the final scene with the main character and his son on the beach, with Ryuji and Mai, who are both now resurrected Sadako versions of themselves, who are all dressed in black and super pale and kind of gothic looking, doesn't work for me at all. I think this movie drops the ball in the last 10 minutes. There's a lot of interesting things going on with this. Again, like you said, the sex scene that gets Mai infected so that she gives birth. The scene where they pull her body out of the smokestack is really cool, where they pull her out, and then when they reveal, they're like, she just recently gave birth, and the look on his face was like, oh no, like like that doesn't make any sense. I think is interesting. I don't know if it was a smokestack, air inlet, I think is what they refer to it as. And like, this movie just keeps hitting you with all these hooks and these uppercuts that it's almost hard to keep up. Like you said, it moves really quickly. By the last half of this movie, you're getting hit with so much plot and so much information that you're like, I don't know how to put this together. If the first film had not enough of it, this movie's got way too much. And it's just throwing it on you.
Because it's so down tempo, but it's got so much more coming at you. It's kind of funny.
Yeah, I mean, it literally just keeps going.
This movie's mood is actually more contemplative than Ring was. This is definitely a thinking horror.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. Ring was more of discovery horror.
Yeah.
And this is definitely more thinking. It's like throwing stuff at you, and they're expecting you to pick up what's necessary and move on with it.
Because what I like about the ending and kind of what's horrifying about it isn't inherently the event. Nothing about these people being resurrected is inherently. It's just even being offered that choice. You can live with this homunculus, this facsimile of your son, if you just let me end the world.
Yeah.
And it's almost worse, and it's almost Lovecraftian in how the fact is he couldn't do anything about it either way. So she's almost giving him this choice for arbitrary reasons, and that's kind of terrifying to me.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. I never thought about it that way, because I thought, I think the scene where she confronts him, where he finally figures out that Mai, who still looks like Mai, is actually Sadako, resurrected, or a clone, or whatever you want to call her. The scene, they're in an office where it's glass in it, and the way that it's shot, they're spinning around the office, they're walking around it, almost like two combatants on in like a gladiator arena, like circling each other. And when they finally come together to meet and talk about like the compromise of getting his son back for it, which there is a picture that I can't remember if it's Mai or Ryuji from the opening, where I think they find it's Ryuji's picture, where he draws the picture of the guy with his son on the beach.
Mm-hmm.
And you get this idea of that people that could read the future. And, Mai at one point says, you can't see your own future. So she can't see her own future. For me, as an interesting idea of, again, bringing it full circle, but also adds in so many plot holes to it. Because you're like, couldn't you just read that guy's future and been like, oh, shit, bad stuff's going to happen? Like, like if you're Maya in that case, I think this idea of like especially being able to read the future doesn't work for me.
And I actually think that herein lies the first kind of buckling with Spiral hewing so close to its book version, but clashing against the changes the movie brought to it. Because another thing about the book is in the original, in the first book, Sadako is by and large an afterthought to the book. She's more catalyst than anything because it's more focused on the mystery of what's going on. So, by extension, by the time you hit this movie and it's kind of focused on that same medical angle of figuring all that out, this story doesn't work with a Yurei, really. So,
Yeah.
all the stuff they establish with Sadako in the first movie, it's more than clashing. They almost have to kick it to the wayside for any part of this movie to make any goddamn sense. I like this movie a lot, but I like this movie in a vacuum. In a franchise sense, it makes no sense.
Right. And it's easy to see why audiences rejected it. We like Ring. We like that ghost story, traditional meets modern ghost story. This, as you said, is not a ghost story. This is medical horror. It just happens to use Ring as a launch point for it. And there's
Definitely
a
kicks in a couple of leaps of logic you have to accept to make the medical parts work. But if you're willing to make those jumps, the medical parts actually do have a logic to them.
yeah, and what's funny is I like Spiral. I like this movie. I like the nihilism. I like the characters they choose. Um, I like the visions that they have in it, the way they use ESP, the way they use kind of that telekinesis portion of it. There's a lot of interesting things to dissect here. I think there's a lot of stuff to just like chew on and think about. And like you said, it's really contemplative in a lot of ways. And I think that's the benefit of seeing this movie. And it's kind of a shame that it ended up being a special feature in this box set for that reason, because it is a fascinating film, if anything. And for that, I think it's worth seeing if you're a fan of this franchise, just to see what other direction it could have gone potentially, that it kind of goes later on, once if we ever get to the second part of this Ring franchise for the Japanese portion of it. They start talking a little bit more about this material, but for the sake of the next two films, this movie literally is a forgotten sequel, and it is completely kicked to the curb for the following next two films.
That rolls us right into Ring 2, which basically, to quote the great Monty Python, and now for something completely different.
The original director, Hideo Nakata, comes back for this one. It's pretty obvious that this is, I think Ring 2 feels like a knee-jerk reaction to the people who hated Spiral. I don't think it's as thoughtful as it needs to be. I don't think I technically give this the same score as Spiral. I don't know if I like it as much as Spiral, because I do feel like that knee-jerk reaction is going on.
What's funny is I mentioned my list of storyline bullet points for Spiral and how it's got a lot of plot but very few bullet points. Ring 2 is its dead opposite. I actually fully agree with your knee jerk reaction because I have 100 bullet points for Ring 2, but the plot is simple as can be. Like, really, especially coming off of the first Ring. Like, if you know what happened in the first Ring, you know what's happening here.
Yeah, and it's and Japanese cinema has always been really, really quick about turning around sequels. Even like from the beginning of time, Japanese cinema has been like, "Oh, this is good. We're gonna make 17 sequels, and they're all gonna be within 5 years." And you're like, "Oh my god! Like, how do you manage that?" Because you're looking at, when you look at the timeline, you're looking at Ring and Spiral came out the same year, right? Same time frame, 1998. Ring 2 comes out 1999.
That's
The
actually
next year, they have course corrected completely within 1 year. And then Ring Zero Birthday, which is the fourth film we'll talk about in a second, 2000. So within the span of 2 years, 98 or 3 years, 98, 99, 2000, you've got 4 films in this franchise. They knocked these suckers out, and they were just in. I
And
think
might almost even be worth touching, just briefly touching on the fact that this is just the start of this franchise in Japan as well. Like, this has been
right,
going a while.
yeah. Oh yeah, this franchise is crazy. I think once we get to the end of this franchise and we finally cover, all the American films or whatever order we decide to go in, when we talk about the franchise as a whole, if we tried to make a flow chart, it would be insane because this franchise is like it's not a flow chart, it's a fucking web. It's like a web conspiracy. Is what this is. We're going to have like strings tied
Like
in.
Charlie Day and
Yeah, Charlie Day in Always
Sun.
Sunny in Philadelphia. Um, I like this movie, like I do. I like Spiral. There's things about this movie I really like. It kind of rings hollow for me compared to the first one, as as weirdly as it is a replication, as a clone of the first one.
So, rolling into it, basic. This movie starts where Ring ends, with Sadako's body being recovered from the well. And so her uncle Takashi is summoned to identify her body, which, as we saw in the first movie, is only a skeleton, so that's kind of a weird thing.
The first plot hole, we need you to identify the skeleton. Yep, sure looks like her.
She was always very pale.
Stick thin, really.
But then this detective tells her their forensics guys think that she survived for about 30 years in the well, which by my sketch of the timeline means she died about a year before the first movie.
This scene is this scene is super problematic for a variety of reasons. For the both of the ones just mentioned, but they mentioned so much. This is a lot of like exposition to get us set up for the
Because that's where
sequel.
they start the whole thing with the C in Sadako as well.
Yeah, right. This is this is very much like this idea of like, this is a direct sequel to Ring. Please forget that Spiral ever existed. This whole scene is kind of like that. This whole like first act is like that. It's like begging you to forget that Spiral ever existed.
It really, the whole first act feels like a giant backpedal.
Oh, it totally goes through and it's like, okay, don't forget this is what we established in Ring, but not Spiral. It's literally almost like an apology letter for the first act. And but there is so much weird shit. So, like you said, they kind of mentioned that he is an uncle, the gentleman, which we're never really sure what his relationship to her is. Is he
Not
the father? There's later on they talk about that she has no father. She was fathered by something in the sea, which is this own mythology building. So you get this idea that he's the doctor that helped out, possibly, maybe he's an uncle. There's a lot of kind of question to that. They also mentioned in the sequence that Sadako has no birth records.
And like you said, she's fathered by this thing in the sea, and by extension, Takashi decides to give her a burial at sea, which, by again, any Western movie logic means, well, the corpse is gone, obviously, there's no more ghost.
Yeah, right. Or you're like, this is obviously this is in Japanese literature and mythology. You talk about water demons and how Sadako very much resembles water demons in a lot of ways, things like that. And you're like, she's born from this monster in the sea. There's this idea that the sea was like this thing for her. Both movies, both Ring 2 and Ring, open up with shots of the ocean with the title cards. So you get this idea that the sea is really important. So if you are trying to get rid of the body, I think the last thing I would ever fucking do is put her into the sea, because I'd be worried that that would like empower her spirit. I'd be like, oh, she's a sea demon, let's put her into the sea. That's a real fucking bad choice as far as I'm concerned, that you're just asking for bad things to happen at that point.
So we meet up with Mai. Here she is again.
Yep, played by the same actress. She got a 3-picture deal out of this. I just want to point that out.
But her and colleague by the name of Okazaki are investigating Ryuji's death, and their first big clue is when they get to Ashikawa's apartment and are starting to put this together, they find burnt tapes. And they basically end up concluding that Reiko's father died the same way Ryuji did.
And when they find the grandfather and they pull him out, there's the scene where they do it. I love that
That classic face, yeah.
yeah, well, they don't show grandfather's face.
Right.
they only show the detective reacting to it, which was kind of a nice change because like in the first Ring, by the end of it, they always show you the face of the person who died in terror, and I like that they didn't show the grandfather's face. They probably couldn't get him back for the picture deal.
One of the things that's funny, and Gore Verbinski's version took it a little too far, but one of the points that the remake did have that I thought was good is the entire idea is that they die with such a horrible look on their face. They're actually horrible to look at. That's a good point. Not showing the face is a better move in this specific instance.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder if because they do show the grandfather in Ring, if they couldn't get him. I think it might have been a cost saving measure more than anything else. But I do like that they showed the detective's face because it kind of reminds you of like the terror of seeing what had happened to them originally. So I actually kind of like that's how they do it, and that's kind of how they go through that. I know you mentioned Reiko's colleague, for the journalist. He is once again fucking walking exposition in this movie. He spends this first act as just chatting through everything. Oh, this is what they were working on. And you're like, okay. And maybe it's because I watched these films so close to each other on this latest rewatch that I was just like, I don't need this. Yeah,
Yeah.
like you're explaining, or maybe it's just because I love Ring so much. I'm like, don't explain everything to me. Shame on you.
Although I do think it's an interesting detail at this point that in the course of his investigation, Okazaki does meet a student who watched the tape by the name of Kanae, who begs him to watch her copy because she's coming really close to her 1 week mark. As he's investigated as far as he is, he's too scared to watch the tape and puts it away in the top drawer of his desk.
And lets her die.
Absolutely.
And I mean, we're skipping ahead with this, but I think this is an important thread because his character really is kind of pointless until the very last moment of the movie, because then you realize that all he is a way to either spin off the franchise or create a sequel that's not Sadako.
Yeah.
Because
It does feel like they were trying to set up Kane's spirit as another kind of,
yeah.
Being you're further in this, just for my own personal notification, do they ever pick this thread back up?
No, this is something that gets dropped like a lead balloon, and they really do, because his character has the moment where he puts the tape and he gets too afraid. That happens before the third act, and he kind of disappears for the entirety of the third act. So you kind of forget about him until the very end of the movie, and it's a stinger scene where we see he's in the hospital institution, and he's kind of gone crazy. Well, he puts the tape in the desk, and then she dies, and then he goes to watch the tape of the interview, and he sees her face start to move weird, and you get this idea that like she's gonna haunt him, right? And you're not sure if it's Sadako or not, and then you realize it's her, and she's just gonna haunt him like she's the new Sadako or something.
Which, if we can backpedal a little, one of the things I do kind of like about this movie, and I do always have a weird obsession with just scummy characters, admittedly, but in one of the bigger shitbird moves in any of these things, when Kanae dies, Okazaki destroys all records of ever having met her. He completely distances himself from it.
Yep. And it makes for an interesting subplot. And I like the idea that they want to spin it off or create a new franchise. And it's dropped, but it's interesting. It's weird that he starts off as an exposition character and ends up being like a stinger moment at the end as a character. And I don't know if it works as well for me. I don't think it's threaded in as naturally, particularly because he seems like he's going to be a big role in the beginning as he's doing all the exposition.
Yeah.
And then they kind of drop that whole thread. And I don't think it works. It doesn't flow nearly as well as I would hope.
They dropped that whole thread and that character because at about this point, Mai finds Reiko and Yoichi from the first movie, the mother and son, who offers to try and help. Okay, another thread we missed is Keiko's niece, who died at the beginning of the first movie, had a friend who witnessed the death and basically develops this like phobia of televisions, and she hasn't like spoken a word in years. And she's subject to these experiments where they're kind of trying to drain off her negative psychic energy by having her project her thoughts onto a TV, bringing this whole thread back up. Although in what's actually kind of a really rad scene, the scene where they actually try and do that, what ends up showing up on screen is the cursed tape. And basically everyone in the room gets completely screwed.
Which again brings up a weird plot hole to this, is that if she
Never
did
saw.
she or did she not watch the tape?
I got the impression, because I got the impression from the first movie, it's talking about the same friend that was in the house, right?
Who didn't watch the tape. But then why is Sadako like haunting her? Is it because she saw Sadako? And if case, like, is it just like a byproduct of Sadako's curse that if you see the curse happen, then you also die? Like, I don't know. I'm not picking up what it's throwing down at this point. And maybe I'm just an idiot, but I'm like, I'm not picking this up. I'm not picking up where that connection is. Yeah,
So
I'm not buying it. I'm not buying when it's you're right. The scene where they go to the hospital where she's being held and she's got this fear, and the scene where they bring her out and they've got the curtain so she won't see the TV that's in the kind of the common room, whatever. Really interesting visual scene. But again, like as Sadako's like coming, like as the well shows up and you see Sadako walking on the TV, all the other patients in the institution start freaking out. So you're not sure, are they seeing Sadako? Are they not? In which case, are all of them going to die because Sadako was coming for the girl? And if that's the logic we're using, if you see Sadako, period, you're going to die. I don't know. I'm just not a great sequence. I'm not buying it.
very spooky, but yeah, it has definite problematic implications. Exactly. Anyway, once again, basically, they decide their move is going to be to exercise Sadako's hate. And the mechanics of this are just alien because basically they're trying to drain her hate into like this pool.
Because they see fresh water is what's going to contain her. And again, she's a water demon. I don't know, whatever. I mean,
And they're trying to use Yoichi as kind of like a conduit, which is
so Yoichi, I like what they do with Yoichi in this film. Because he saw the tape, because he survived and saw the tape, he has extra abilities. You get this idea that if you survive the tape, you have this kind of extra ability. I'm buying that. Yeah, I can buy that. And you get Yoichi has these abilities because Mai, who has been previously established, does have ESP, sees visions of him. He's like immediately kind of connected to her. He's got these things. I like the idea that Yoichi is like an anti-venom to Sadako. He's got some of the same powers that she does, right? In terms of like telekinetic powers, things like that. But he's made because her evil, like if you're doing anti-venom, she's a snake, she bites you, the poison that's put into you is what is used to make the anti-venom to be able to defeat her. I like that they start to set that up, and I don't think they quite hit it at the end. They set it up nicely and they kind of dropped the ball.
makes for an interesting dichotomy between the two versions of Ring 2 because Ryuji's so fundamentally different in how he's portrayed between the two versions. Again, he's more antagonistic in Spiral, whereas he is an out and out good guy in this movie.
Right. Yeah, he is out and out a good guy in this. And I do like that they brought him back again. Again, he got a 3-picture deal out of this too.
And for the story that this movie is telling, it's a logical direction. Because again, in a vacuum, okay, no, this movie does not work in a vacuum. But as a sequel to Ring, it makes more sense than Spiral does.
Right.
So on that level and the way they characterize Ryuji and everything, it does kind of make sense. But basically, they're trying to drive Sadako's hate into this pool, and it just goes predictably horribly wrong because, as you said, she appears to be the daughter of some sort of water demon, and maybe that's not your element against her.
She's yeah, and I do love that they're like at like a high school swimming pool, like a gymnasium swimming pool. That it made me laugh every time I see that. So
And what I think's kind of a cool move, basically, a lot of people. So one person's like driven insane and ends up jumping into the pool with a bunch of electronic equipment in their arms, and another one dies. But basically, Mai and Yoichi fall into the pool, and when they break above the water, they're in the well. And stuck in the well with Sadako, especially as she's presented in these movies, not a great scenario.
Yeah, and there's this weird thread that they introduced earlier where when they're trying to figure out, like when the police are investigating, they start to try to rebuild her face using her skull.
Mhm.
So they use her skull to rebuild the face, and you get a scene where they're like going with pictures and trying to figure it out, and they're using clay to kind of sculpt it to, as they do in kind of forensic investigations. And then before the uncle, father figure, whatever, buries her at sea, he goes in to identify her via the sculpture that they have created. And they give the sculpture to him with because it has the skull in it, right? To put into the casket for him to bury her at sea. And they take pictures of her and you see a ghostly visage. It's kind of a cool visual effect when you see the ghostly visage on the thing. All of that, like as it's happening, as you're watching the movie, you're like, what the fuck is this here for? Right? You're like, what is this? Right? What are you guys doing? What is this plot that you're trying to thread in here? And and it almost pays off in this final moment when they go back into the well. Because when Mai and Tuishi are in the well and they're in the water, Ryuji comes out, he takes away all of Sadako's energy from Tuishi. He absorbs it himself, and then he magically makes a rope appear so they can climb out because, ghost stuff.
What I will give as what I think is the effect of this movie, the best effect of this movie. And it's an old simple effect, but the way Sadako scales the wall after them, because she's chasing them up this well, and it just looks so good in this movie.
It's so good. And going back to my point with the sculpted feature, that when she looks at her, she has the sculpted face, not her face. Because like
Very
her
spooky.
it's super spooky looking, and I'm like, oh shit, like that weird two scene thing that you set up before kind of paid off for this kind of really creepy moment as she's climbing the wall. And because Ryuji kind of tells them, hey, don't look back, whatever you do, don't look back. And when they look back, that's when Sadako appears and starts climbing the wall. But yeah, Sadako's got this like crazy face. I love this the ending of this movie. I love it. Like you said, it almost has this weird Nightmare on Elm Street feel to it. The well in the pool, things like that. I love that Sadako climbs this wall, gets to them on the thing, goes up to Mai, and this is the only time Sadako technically speaks the whole
That's a
movie.
good arm too. I mean, she's
Yeah,
got her dead to rights by all horror logic.
yeah, right. She's caught up to him. There's no hope, and she looks at her and she says, "Why are you the only one saved?" And then falls back into the well and lets them go.
And
And
it's
that's,
enigmatic. It's never explained. That I actually is one of the things I do like about this movie.
I think it's haunting. I
Yeah.
think it's like almost like she let them live to kill them with guilt later on or something like that. And it's like, man, I loved it. I loved that moment. I love this whole sequence. I love that that's what she says to her.
And the
Uh,
reason it hits with such a powerful force is one of the few times I think it was a good change in the movies to make Sadako an inherently evil character, because it's implied that she was always horrible.
yeah.
And basically, well, until we get to the next movie, boy, we'll touch on that in a second. But so it makes it more than like a normal. It's not just enigmatic in that kind of annoying, pretentious art film student way of a clown flipping a pancake in slow motion and it's supposed to mean something. It's one of those things that actually sticks with you because you're like, what could she possibly mean by that? It doesn't feel inappropriate. It feels like something that should happen. It feels like the right way for this to go. But it's exactly like you say, it's haunting.
Yeah, it's weird. And like part of me wondered if this ending was supposed to be a throwback because there's a sequence before that we didn't talk about where they go back to where Sadako was born and where the event happened where her mother was killed and blah blah blah. And he tells them the story about Sadako's birth. Sadako was born, her Sadako's mother gave birth in the sea. She left the baby there, went back the next day, came back with a baby. There's this idea that Sadako, I don't think, was human kind of deal. That's where you're supposed to get this idea that she never was. And then he takes him down to the cave where Sadako was born because he says the mom literally would not have the doctors or whatever and ran down to the ocean, went to a cave and gave birth. He takes him down to the cave and it's this dark cave called, and he refers to it as Children's Limbo. And it's
Yeah.
this cave with all these statues of children at the top. And he makes mention that this is where people would take children that they didn't want anymore. And then when the tie got high enough, it would take away the unwanted children. And then if they were still there, then they would be saved. If the tie took them away, though, they were the unwanted children. But that's where Sadako was born, which adds a lot of really cool mystique to her mythos, I think. And I think that there's kind of this reference to that later on where it says, why are you the only one saved? Like maybe she wasn't saved. Maybe she was one of these children that was taken to sea and then brought back as something else. And I think that that's where all the failures that this movie has, when it hits its notes like this, like the finale and this moment with the cave, I think it's so good that it's like, oh yeah, you were right to completely disregard Spiral and essentially reboot this franchise. And yeah, I don't know. I think that those moments, for every one of those moments, you get like the doctor who's like, we need a lot of fresh water to absorb Sadako's fury. But for every one of those moments, you get something that's really good. So I think that that's an interesting way to kind of balance this movie out.
So I think this movie's interesting. It's back. It's definitely strongly back in the Uri horror genre. It's back in, like you say, kind of a discovery horror mode. Although this has a very distinct focus on the psychic aspect of this plot. And I don't mean like it's present. I mean it's like the plot of this movie.
Oh yeah, with the institution and the tests that they're doing on the friend.
Yeah.
like I kept giving you glasses of water and now they taste like they're carbonated. I don't know. There's a lot of ESP stuff going on in this movie, and it's interesting because it does bring in a little bit more of that scientific side to it.
Mm-hmm.
From Spiral, that's saying like we're going to try to analyze this with science. It's just that none of the science makes sense and it feels like it's a gimmick.
In a weird way, this movie vaguely reminds me of The Exorcist 3. No, 2. Sorry. The Heretic, just in the institution and all that stuff, like just
AKA one of the worst movies ever made.
Yeah. Hey, whoa. I'm gonna tell you that locust headdress wearing James Earl Jones is deeply offended by that statement.
Well, I'm okay with that.
No. I'm just saying I definitely got shades of it through this movie because this movie does actually kind of feel more like they're trying to cast Sadako as like demon possessed, like you said, a very Japanese variation thereof, where in the first Ring, she's pretty unambiguously a ghost, or at least to Western understanding, what we'd call a ghost. In this, she's definitely evolved into something else. She's above and beyond. She's more what you'd call if you want to get Japanese genre-y about it, she'd be what you'd call a yokai now. Which is like a minor god or something, basically.
Right.
And I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing per se, but it's definitely, the plot has to go through some real gymnastics to justify it.
some Samara gymnastics from the Ring. Some contortionist moves to get you there. So, but I mean, it's interesting because it, like you said, it does build her mythos a lot. And I think that's interesting. It builds a lot of her origin story, which is, I mean, moving on to the next film makes the Ring Zero birthday even more interesting.
Or to present an alternate look at that particular point, all of that stuff that makes the Ring Zero birthday make no goddamn sense at all. Prepare to fit everything we just said in the last 20 minutes. It does maintain the mysterious fathered by the sea aspect, and it does maintain a couple of things that would require, that work better if she's not human. Let's just say that.
Right.
But at the same time, this movie's asking us to, on top of everything else we've learned about Sadako, believe that there was this real specific period between like 16 and 19 where she was just a perfectly normal girl.
Well, and so for listeners,
sorry, normal's pushing it, but I should actually say, but where she went to high school and lived a normal life.
Right. And for listeners out there, we're talking about Ring Zero Birthday, which is the subtitle for it, which is a prequel. It is meant to serve as a prequel to both Ring and Ring 2.
Yep,
That goes into Sadako's teenage years,
yep. And this
which
movie amazingly actually starts on just specifically the shot of her uncle dad braining her with a machete and shoving her down a well, and then just cuts to black and goes 30 years earlier. And like, it's so abrupt, you almost feel like you're going to see Sadako falling down the well and hear the record scratch and be like, boy, wonder how I got here.
well, and that's right, because once again, this movie, because it's a prequel, it opens up with a modern day sequence with a girl talking on her phone to her friend, talking about, oh, have you heard about the cursed videotape? Because I guess that shit's still going around, even though I feel like we've moved on. The cursed videotape is like barely mentioned in
Either of the Ring sequels. Yeah.
yeah. So it's become such a subplot point. So this one, the girl's on her phone talking with it, and she's like, "I've had these weird dreams lately." And then they go into the scene where they have like the dreams with the house, and then yeah, her father, uncle, doctor, whoever he is, yeah, um, killing Sadako, or maybe not. I guess she lived in the well for 30 years. I don't know. The fucking timeline on this. Well, I guess that would make sense why it's 30 years earlier, right? Killing her, and then it flashes back. So this is the first problem of this movie as a prequel. Number one, prequels are problematic, can be problematic, because we already know how things end. So you have to make the journey to get to that point really interesting. And
And
unfortunately, I think the mystery behind Sadako is far more interesting than anything you could actually ever tell us. The less you tell us about Sadako, the better, or the more
uh,
vague, weird things that you tell us is better.
and if you're really, really gonna put your foot down and insist on giving us the origin of Sadako, maybe not a milk toast remake of Carrie.
Oh, yeah, I can't tell you. So the first time I saw Ring Zero, I had no expectations for it. I had literally just binge watched Spiral and Ring 2, and I was like, going on to the next one. It's Ring Zero. And I knew it was a prequel, but I tried to keep my mind open for it. And you're so right. It is such a Carrie knockoff in so many ways. And I should send you my notes for this movie because you will never have more dripping sarcasm than what's in my notes for this movie. I am such a sarcastic little bastard when it comes to watching this movie. And I don't know if this movie is necessarily as bad as I think it is. Like even on this most recent watch, I'm like, you know what? There's things to like about this movie. It's just it
Again,
doesn't feel like a Ring movie.
in a vacuum, and this one it works better than Ring 2 did. In a vacuum, this is not a terrible movie. I would actually completely, aside from any other Ring movie, call it a really Japanese remake of Carrie. That's like not cute. That's very point by point what this is. Um, but that said, it's not the worst way to spend 90 minutes.
No, and I think that's both what's kind of good about it and kind of super frustrating is that it really doesn't feel like a Ring movie. In fact, I have like reference points in my notes all the time. It's like Carrie, 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 Carrie. Why did it turn slasher? Carrie, Carrie, Carrie. Like
Well, and their mental gymnastics this movie asks you to make. Well, we'll get there. Let's start with what this movie's about. So, getting aside from what we all know, it jumps back to when the tragedy happened at Sadako's mother's ESP display.
shindig.
Obviously, one of the people who died was a reporter because it wouldn't be a Ring movie without him.
We get two of them in this one.
And this one basically the dying one had a fiance, Akiko, and basically Akiko is trying to learn more about the tragedy that killed her fiance, and if basically the daughter Sadako was involved, while Sadako herself is, I believe, 19, and on her therapist's suggestion joins a drama troupe.
As a theater kid, I could say, yeah, I could see her totally being a theater kid. Yeah, I don't know. Like even like just getting it started this way, you have her essentially almost like part of the system. She gets kind of chucked around as a kid after her mother dies, And number one, I don't love that she's like 19 years old. In my head, Sadako was always younger than that. And
Yeah.
that's kind of what made it scarier, that
No,
she was like this,
I think
like,
the books expressly say she's 16.
right. That she's kind of an unhinged teen, kind of this like,
I think even the movies, I've always felt like it's implied she was younger. In the American movie, I think she's straight up supposed to be a preteen.
yeah, she's like 12.
Yeah. And in the first Japanese movie, it's never explicit, but it's definitely implied that she's young.
Right. Yeah. And so having her older already kind of like made me a little bit wary of it. And even as you were talking about, like before we even get to her, we have the reporter going to like people and interviewing her about Sadako and the event and blah, blah, blah.
This old teacher and
Yeah, and they go to the teacher, and the teacher's like, "Oh, Sadako was always afraid of the sea." And I was like, "God damn it, she is a water demon." I'm like, "Why?" And they're like, "Sadako wouldn't even go to the beach. We went to the beach one time, and all the kids went into the water, and then they just started screaming, and and then they like don't answer it." I was like, "Did they die? Did she kill them with her powers?" I have so many questions.
actually, that's interesting because the translation I watched just said that all the children went into the water and drowned.
Oh, yeah, the translation I watched said all the kids went into the ocean and then they started screaming. And then it was like, and that was it. Like the translation I watched didn't actually explain that. That's fascinating.
Brief. Either way, something terrible happened to these children in the water. That's the takeaway.
Yeah, and you're like, I don't know. Maybe she killed him. Maybe she was the one that killed him with her, this idea that, she has uncontrollable use of telekinesis, which is what we kind of find out later, is that they're controlled by emotions because Carrie and maybe she killed these kids. But I don't, again, like even the way this movie starts off, I'm like, oh, it's another reporter, another interview with somebody, and now Sadako's afraid of the sea. I don't know. I'm starting off on the wrong foot. Just in this first 15 minutes, I'm off on the wrong foot.
So within the drama troupe, Sadako is understudying a part that the actress Aiko has, and Aiko basically starts having these nightmares about a well and a house with stairs that she's afraid to go up, which what I will say is one of the more effective kind of dialogue slash tension unpleasant kind of scares in the movie. The lady she's telling the story to it starts off where she's kind of making fun of her for having a nightmare and she's kind of teasing her, but as Aiko goes through and tells this story, she just kind of dead stops, looks at her and goes, I've been having the exact same nightmare. And that's actually it was the timing of it. It's just a really effective little creep, I thought.
And I think this movie does that throughout. I think there's effective moments in this movie throughout it. I just think it's such a different tone than the rest of the films that it really does. It feels less like a sequel or a prequel to the other to the Ring series as Spiral does. I think Spiral feels more like a Ring film than this does.
So basically, Aiko dies mysteriously. And
yeah, in a chair, sitting down, which is how I truly think I'll end up going. So, I mean, like, it's fair enough.
Making the same face, actually.
Yeah, making the face. Yeah, I'll have milk eye and everything.
Which, admittedly, at least the death face looked cooler in this one.
Yeah, and it's brief. It's like her head tilts back, and it's like, here's the death face, bam, cut. And it's like, okay, that's cool.
She dies mysteriously, and so Sadako basically starts developing this relationship with a sound tech named Toyama, and Toyama's girlfriend is not especially impressed with this.
I mean, we did add a love triangle in here, and I think if I was the old girlfriend, I wouldn't be impressed with it either. I'd be like, really, the weird girl who suddenly has the lead in the play grumbles at the kids in the background.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, Sadako, well, being the understudy, does get the lead part. And she also, it's implied the director's a little bit lecherous and has moved his affections onto Sadako. And there's a lot going on in this movie.
and the play's about a girl who dies and then gets reborn. I was like, oh, you're being like you're so clever, movie.
To briefly touch on that, and I'd kind of jump into the end here, but spoiler alert, Sadako dies.
Oh, What?
One of the things I specifically mentioned earlier that I thought was cool about Ring was kind of updating the Uri thing. She's wearing a white dress, but it's not like a burial gown. And then they go and have her die in her costume from this play, which is a burial gown. It's just one of those things where it's like, it's not strictly speaking a problem, but it's just something I thought was kind of annoying.
Well, yeah, and I think that's what this movie is trying so hard to get everything where it needs to be for like this finale to get you where Sadako is, that it almost becomes like a checklist.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, check, check,
In the
check.
course of this, the reporter ends up meeting back up with the teacher who said she was afraid to tell this story first time they met, but she did check up on Shizuko and Sadako's family once. And she went in, sees Shizuko combing her hair in that famous shot from the first movie, and then kind of come around and you realize she's gone completely insane at some point here. This is presumably right before her own suicide. But then she sees Sadako, but hears another child upstairs. And then
the doctor, father, uncle, kind of explains that there was two Sadakos later on. He literally explains that, and it's even at that moment it's super kind of confusing on what he means. And I don't know if they're intentionally trying to be vague with it, whether or not it's just like multiple personalities, or if there's like a demon in her, exorcist kind of style, or
never comes down on a side on that at any point, because you never actually see the air quote evil Sadako.
Right, it's not like
you see it's like a shade, but
right, and you never see them like together in the same picture, kind of, or whatever. So it's the idea, I think, is what they're playing with, is that there's kind of together, that it's the same person, it's just two sides of her personality or whatever it might be, which is problematic in its own regards. But yeah, you get in this moment where, because Sadako doesn't really, she as a character, she refers that she doesn't remember her childhood. And so, because every Ring movie is trying to unravel the mystery of Sadako, this one is also trying to unravel the mystery of Sadako, except
for new mysteries. But
yeah, right. But Sadako's the one who's unraveling the mystery of Sadako, which is this weird, like, where it starts to eat its tail. We're going full circle here with the Ring motif.
So, in what may be the most ill-advised move in cinematic history, not the play, Toyama's jealous girlfriend, who admittedly at this point has no reason to believe Sadako is actually dangerous, but the girl who gave her the tape, the reporter, had every reason to believe Sadako is dangerous, which is why I call this such an ill-advised move.
It's also an ill-advised cinematic move, because she might as well have dumped pig's blood.
Yeah, right? Because what she does is Toyama's girlfriend blasts during the play the audio of the night of Sadako's mother's humiliation and her subsequent murder of several people in that whole event, which Sadako does not take well. And she basically
we get so many flashbacks in this sequence. It's like flashbacks and flashbacks and flashbacks. Which I despise in terms of like cinematic language. I'm like, not unless it's a joke, don't try that.
Yeah. But and it gets all confused, and she starts seeing her mom, and she starts seeing basically her therapist runs up and is trying to calm her down, and she murders him real bad. Though we're not super clear how, she does seem to do it in the typical Ring fashion, and he falls on these candles, and it's really dramatic and cool. But basically, at this point, the rest of the drama troupe twigs on to the feeling they've had the whole time, which is that she does have supernatural powers, and with this last piece of evidence decide she's obviously the one that murdered Eiko, and they beat her to death with candlesticks like the world's most perverse version of Clue.
Yeah, like, and it's funny because it's like all this starts to happen and it's like instant mob mentality for the troupe, the acting troupe and theater troupe.
Person rains a blow upon her, and then all of a sudden they are all beating this poor girl.
Yeah. Well, they like chase her into the dressing room, which is even better. Like it starts off like this weird kind of chase sequence, and you're like, okay, this is what's going to happen. And yeah, it's a bold choice because essentially they take her to Dr. Uncle Father, And
Who says, wait, you didn't bring Sadako here, did you?
oh, when they first opened the door.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So you know what he says in mine?
No. Well after. Like, he's aware
Oh,
they brought it. He's just like, what? You brought her here?
yeah. Literally, when he first opens the door in the translation I have on the Arrow Blu-rays, he says, "Are you here to kill Sadako?"
Oh,
Like
yeah.
that's
Sorry,
the first fucking line. And it's like you have like a mob with a lady with a gun and all these like bloodied candlesticks, and it's like, fuck yes, we are. We are here to kill Sadako.
and
And like I openly laughed when he said that. I was like, yes, this movie gets so ridiculous.
and they search through the house and find exactly nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and this is where we get to the point where it's like this idea of like evil Sadako versus good Sadako, where he talks about the explanation of two Sadakos. He even says to the point of like, I use drugs to stop the other one from growing. And I think you're supposed to get the idea that maybe there was like two kids in the womb or something to that effect, and that they merged together and one is evil and one is good. And now there's like a battle over her body or whatever. They don't fall on any side of that. But again, it takes away the mystery of like the evil Sadako that takes over. Like we don't see good in the previous films of Sadako. There's no good there. And so now that we see like a good Sadako, it's a prequel that poisons the well. Then it's like, oh man,
My first thought was, what did she eat? And then I'm like, well, she's an evil spirit. Then I'm like, but she's alive, so she's not an evil spirit. What did she eat?
yeah, what did she eat? Moss. She lived on moss.
Yeah.
But this is where they come up with the two Sadakos.
So pissed she was alive for 30 years.
Yeah. She ate rage. She just ate rage. Yeah, I don't know. They bring up this two Sadako things. I don't think it works as well as it wants to work.
He definitely thinks it's being clever, which is always the worst state a movie can be in.
This movie thinks it's clever from beginning to end.
Mm-hmm.
It really does, and it's trying so hard to be clever, and it's trying so hard to hit all of the checkpoints that it doesn't work for me. It doesn't flow. It doesn't feel natural at a lot of the times. It's got good moments. It doesn't work. So by the time we get to this third act, they end up there, and it weirdly turns into a slasher film for a hot minute.
Because the good Sadako just kind of pops back awake, and her and Toyama go running, and they hit this like cliff's edge, and you can see the ocean underneath, and all of a sudden Sadako's super afraid because here comes her fear of the water that shouldn't be there. And basically
evil Sadako's triggered by the water.
And suddenly, if you're looking through the scene, and what I will give the movie is some really effective camera work, because evil Sadako does have a physical form that we do see a couple times in the movie. And almost every time we see it, it's with a really cool camera effect. There's one where it's panned to the left and Sadako's like outside and they shut the door, and as it pans left, all of a sudden it's in this hallway and she's walking down the hallway at the same pace. And you can tell, like, if you think behind the scenes, it's done with two actresses or whatever, but like in the moment, that's a really scary effect.
Oh yeah, and when she ends up slaughtering most of the troop outside. When she gets into the house though, and she has the main news reporter and the girlfriend, the rival girlfriend, she has them cornered or whatever, and there's the scene where she peeks around the corner and comes walking around, and she's got that creepy jankety walk as she's going. The angles on the camera are fantastic. It gives her this monstrous presence, with her movements. It doesn't have that kind of backwards, unnatural quite movement from the original that was played in reverse. I think like if you would have done that in reverse, it would have been even cooler. But that scene is great. And even the scene, I mean, it goes slasher. She starts killing all these kids outside with her mind, with mind bullets. And
including her erstwhile boyfriend, Toyama.
Yeah, because you know what? Nobody's safe from evil Sadako. She got triggered by the ocean, and she gonna fucking kill everybody because that's what we know from evil Sadako.
Well, that's how you can tell she's evil. It's the indiscriminate killing.
Yeah, it's versus the ritualistic killing of directors and rival actresses. That was fine. That was good Sadako.
That's all good. That's good Sadako.
Yeah, that's good Sadako. Yeah.
Shit. We never found a reason to get into that, but she can.
Yeah, she can. Well, why not? So
this movie's stupid. I'm sorry.
This movie's so stupid. So yeah, she kills all of her classmates. She goes in. she corners the news reporter and the rival girlfriend. I love the scene where they pull away from it because you think there's this idea where the news reporter is going to shoot her because the news reporter has a gun, which I can imagine in 1960s Japan. I don't know if guns were like super prevalent because this would have been 30 years prior to 1990.
There's a reason. There's a really specific scene where it shows why she has that gun.
Right. Okay. Because I was thinking that I was like, they make a big deal out of this gun. So obviously in 1960s Japan, that must have been a big deal.
In pretty much any post-war era of Japan, guns have been illegal for the populace. So there's never been an era in Japan where they were particularly common.
Well, and I think this movie plays that up well with this gun sequence, particularly because you think she's going to shoot Sadako. It cuts away to show Dr. Father Uncle like running back in because he's heard all the commotion. He hears gunshots and he starts running in or whatever. And when we come back, we see that Sadako has somehow made the reporter shoot the other girl and herself. And there's actually, it's kind of a cool reveal sequence in there where when they reveal that that's kind of what's happened. Again, it's a little strange that Sadako, who can, kill you by crushing your heart with her mind, decides to make you shoot yourself. But, I guess like maybe there's a gun message in there or something. I don't know, whatever. So
immediately after that, good Sadako comes back.
Yeah, because the killing's done. The indiscriminate killing's done. She's got to just do her normal killing.
So we got to pump back into the melodrama and force this to fit into the beginning of the ring again. So her father uncle, the doctor, poisons her, and basically she realizes it's happening, goes running away. He catches her at a well where he brains her with a machete and shoves her in, bringing us full circle, and like you say, serpent eating its tail.
Yep. I think it should be mentioned the final two shots of this movie are fantastic. The one where she has the dream sequence with her and Toyama.
That is actually beautiful, and I think you should actually detail that even more specifically because that is a great shot.
It's a great sequence because she gets flipped into the well and you're like, oh, movie's done. And then it has her waking up in a bed and Toyama's there. And it's kind of this romantic scene. It's probably the one scene where I feel like they have true chemistry in this movie.
He loves her and they're gonna run away together.
Yeah, and it's like this weird escapism where it's like finally my life is gonna go right, and she reaches out to touch his face and her hand is on the wall of the well. And I think that in the cut scene there where it's like she reaches out her hand and it cuts to her hand reaching out and touching the wall of the well, and it's her realization of where she's actually at. And then the final scene of the movie is actually this God's eye view of her down in the well, looking up at the sky and screaming. And you just hear and you see like the shadow of the cap being put onto the well. And that's how the movie ends. And I think both of the shots, the dream sequence and that final shot, are just fantastic.
Which evokes the moon imagery that has not been present in the sequels very much, but is in the original movie and a lot of the remakes, the moon imagery.
Right. Even though the term ring, it does not reflect the cap being put on the well like it does in the remake with Gore Verbinski's. I think he was like, we got to give it a reason to call it ring. So like, again, over explaining everything.
Which is funny because when I saw the trailer for that movie in 2001, I thought it was referring to the phone ringing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that doesn't... What? I mean, I guess, like, I'd have been 15. I think I was 15 when that came out. I saw it in theaters. But yeah, so that's Ring 0. So now we've discussed Ring, Spiral, Ring 2, Ring 0 Birthday. What, of the 4 films that we're talking about, this is the first section of this franchise, what are the overall things and themes that you find that you take away from this franchise, and what did you kind of like about it?
So, what do I think of the first 4 as a franchise, kind of a mini franchise? This is actually considered something of a quadrilogy, actually, just in and of itself. Which, when you get a franchise long enough, that does start to happen. You've got, Nightmare on Elm Street 3, 4, and 5 tie in together neatly, for example. But I think that I find these movies kind of largely weak. I think that there are a lot of really, really good ideas at play, but I think it's just not my particular brand of horror, which is shocking to me given how much I do adore the American remake. And I do feel like it just comes down to cultural difference, and not in a way where I disrespect or dislike it. I again, find these films cinematically great. But how about yourself? I know you like the first one, but what do you think of the quadrilogy as kind of a standalone thing?
I think the first four films in this are really interesting. I adore Ring. I adore it. I again probably top 10 film of all time for me. I It's a film I watch at least once a year. I watch it all the time. I love what it has to offer in terms of, again, that modernization of a kind of a traditional story. I like ghost stories. I think all of the sequels present a lot of interesting ideas that never capture the same atmosphere or challenge that the original does. I think Spiral takes some wild left turns that I really appreciate. I will always give the benefit of the doubt to a movie that takes wild swings, even if they miss. So I will give it the benefit of the doubt for that. And I think Spiral for me is that way. I think Ring 2, its knee-jerk reaction to the failure of Spiral is somewhat saddening. When it's good, it's good. Ring 0, I think, is unnecessary and a kind of a waste of time overall. I think it's got good moments. I think if it was a movie that wasn't a Ring movie, I'd have probably enjoyed it more. If it would have been called, you know, uh, Samantha, and it was about a girl who went to a theater troupe who had, ESP powers, and it was a Carrie knockoff from Japan, I probably would have enjoyed it more if it was its kind of its own thing. As is, though, I think the flashback within a flashback within a flashback of it just doesn't work for me. And as you said, I think it tries so hard, it kind of ruins a lot of the mystery and a lot of the what made Sadako such an iconic character in terms of worldwide phenomenon, which is now considered like in the pantheon of great modern monsters for
Yeah.
cinema. Sadako is one of those, and
Oh,
I
yeah.
and I think it's
You certainly can't think about modern horror without the image of a dark-haired girl crawling out of a TV. That is a fact.
yeah, and there's a reason for that, and I think it has a lot to do. And the Ring remake is good, right? And we'll talk more about that in whole later on, but
It doesn't hurt that that's one of the stronger international remakes, I'd almost argue, in history, really.
well, they Americanized it really, really well.
Yeah.
And it was like, okay, that makes sense
It's
for what
not a
it is.
story you'd inherently think would Americanize well.
No, because it is so rooted in kind of Japanese culture, but by making it take place in like Seattle, and they made a lot of smart choices to adapt it to an American audience.
Little
Um,
and all that stuff, yeah.
yeah, so I think that's interesting, and so I really appreciate Ring on the whole, and my love of Ring carries over to the sequels. So I'll watch these. Like I said, I think I've seen Ring, even the one I like the least, which is Ring 0. I've at least seen 3 times now. So
Now,
it's one that I revisit. So
and as a series, I don't know that this has the strongest theming in the world, this series, although there is, if I'd call any one, it would be parentage.
right.
There's definitely it's not always the same theme, but the broad theme of parent, especially motherhood specifically, is
Yeah.
very, very much present in these movies.
And even like when it's not necessarily the main thing, like in Spiral, you have the father who's the main character, the suicidal father. You get this idea that Mai becomes this almost surrogate mother character in it, and she actually gives birth. So there's like this motherhood aspect to that film too. And then even at the end, when the son is resurrected, Mai goes to greet him, and he stops her, and she's like, "Why? But I gave birth to him." And you're like, there we go. There's that kind of that motherhood thing. But I think you're right. Parentage is such a huge theme in this franchise, and
And then there's
and
obviously the huge circle aesthetic, but it's just interesting that it's not the strongest themed franchise. You'd almost assume it was, and it's really not. There's psychics, I guess, are a major theme in it.
I do think, yeah, the ESP is definitely a theme in it. I don't know if it runs with it on a thematic level as much as a plot level. Even with the water ghosts and demons, I think the theme of water is a really interesting one.
Actually, Koji Suzuki, it's not even just his Ring series. Like water is a very major element of everything he
Uh,
writes.
because I read his short story on Dark Water, which was also made into a film directed by Hideo Nakata, who did Ring.
Oh, well,
And Ring 2. Yep, he directed Dark Water, the original one, and that one's fantastic. It's probably one of my favorite J horror films too.
yeah,
But
that's a
I think water's an interesting one in terms, particularly because each film uses water in a slightly different way, which is kind of interesting.
different than others. Ring
Yeah,
2, looking at you.
yeah, yeah. As a way to distill fury. Okay, thanks, Doc.
It's
There's
and Fury is actually a generalized theme of this.
right.
Indignance, righteous rage, unrighteous rage.
Right. Or misplaced rage in a lot of her ways. I think the franchise does go in the idea of cycles or rings in some interesting ways because even Ring 0 feels like it does come full circle.
It does. That's true.
And when you each film, like even if you take like Ring and then Spiral finishes in a way that it feels like it comes full circle. And then when you do Ring and Ring 2 kind of feels like everything comes full circle. It was about if Yoichi is supposed to be the anti-venom or the new Sadako, he makes it out of the well.
Yeah.
He's the one that makes it out because of a mother's love, or Mai's love, or and because his mother dies in it, right,
Yeah.
in kind of a tragic moment. But so I think there's things in the movies that work in the kind of looking at the cycle of things, and when you start to think about it in things that go in circles or cycles, I think the series does kind of work. It doesn't work as a whole on all four that way because of the soft reboot right in the middle, and because of having a prequel for the fourth entry. It doesn't necessarily work in that way, but it does come full circle. If you compare Ring with each separate entry, it does come full circle in a kind of a cool way.
What would you call your favorite and least favorite film within these four? I think it's already fairly apparent what your favorite was.
Oh yeah, yeah. Ring, hands down, favorite. Absolutely, positively,
For the worst.
undeniably, undefiably, that's my favorite is Ring. The worst, I have to go with Ring 0. I just don't think it works. Which is so funny because Spiral is considered the black sheep of this family in so many ways because it doesn't feel like the other three in a lot of ways. Whereas I feel like Spiral's more of a sequel to Ring than Ring 0 is a prequel to Ring. I feel like it works better. So I'm going to say Ring is best, Ring 0 is worst. And what about you?
Actually, I think that Spiral is the best of these. Again, my opinion on this is way more defensible in a pure vacuum. I'm just talking about Spiral by itself. But in that pure vacuum, Spiral is it just touches on a lot of things I like, including just its general, you want to use a word better than darkness because it makes me sound like a 15-year-old edgelord, but I do just kind of like the dour, contemplative atmosphere of it generally. And I do think, just kind of for what works for me, it's the creepiest of the four. Again, the effects and some of the other stuff in it really, really good. As far as the weakest, we are in full agreement, my friend. Ring 0 Birthday is just a really rough watch. Like, for me, this was my first viewing of it, and as soon as I pegged it for kind of a weak carry, I had a hard time even when they do, like you said, they start playing the tape of her mother, and then it's like pig's blood all over again, and you can tell in the moment that's exactly what's happening. It's not as dramatic a kill scene, she doesn't whack the entire troop there, and it definitely goes into its own weird fourth act, but it doesn't change the fact that they were very much trying to lead up to this big carry moment, and they do not pull it off.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And I think as we dig into the rest of this franchise later on, I'm a huge fan of this franchise in whole. I've seen every entry of it except for one at this point, which is the new one, Sadako. And I'm excited to kind of dig into the rest of it just to see what you think, because I know that this is kind of a fresh take for you. It is probably one of my favorite franchises on the whole, simply because it is so strange and it goes some weird fucking places later on. But yeah, so that kind of wraps up our, this entry of No Franchise Fatigue as we look at the first four films from the Ring series. For our listeners out there, if you liked what you kind of heard, obviously we'll be tackling the rest of the Ring series later on down the road. We're going to be jumping into a new franchise next month to kind of tackle it, give you guys a break from Sadako and her evil eye and fingernail-less fingers. So next month we're going to be tackling the 5-film franchise in its entirety. And boy, oh boy, is it going to be explosive. We are examining the Rambo films. So we're going to be doing all 5 of them in the next one. So hopefully we'll try to keep it a little bit shorter. But if you guys out there want to continue to watch along with us, so that'll be coming in November. So you'll want to dive in. If you haven't seen Rambo Last Blood, it is in theaters currently, so you can definitely check that out. We have lots of opinions on this.
It's doing so poorly. By the time we record, there's a fair chance you'll be able to rent it.
Yeah, VOD, man. Oh man, that's probably true. Now that I think about that, that's fun. Okay, yeah, so that's kind of the next one we're talking. As always, let us know kind of what you thought about this episode. We would love to reach out to you, have you kind of chat with us. You can snag me over at Twitter. My handle there is at the movie Matt, MATT.
And you can always email me at nffpod.sean, SEAN, my name is a 4-letter word, at gmail.com.
Till next time, don't watch any unmarked VHS tapes.
And if you find any girls at the bottom of a well, just leave them there.
Thanks, guys.